Even from across the narrow sea they came, from Bravos and Pentos, all three of the daughters, old Volantis. From the summer isles appeared 3 tall black princes in feathered cloaks, whose splendor was a wonder to behold. Every inn and stable in King's Landing was soon full, whilst outside the walls a city of tents and pavilions arose for those unable to find accommodations. A great deal of drinking and fornication took place, claims Mushroom. A great deal of praying and fasting and good works, reports Septon Eustace. The tavern keepers of the city waxed fat and happy for a time, as did the whores of Fleet Bottom and their sisters in the fine houses along the Street of Silk, though the common people complained about the noise and the stink. A desperate, fragile air of forced fellowship hung over King's Landing in the days leading up to the wedding, for many of those crowding cheek by jowl into the city's wine sinks and pot shops had stood upon opposite sides of battlefields a year ago. If only blood can wash out blood, King's Landing was full of the unwashed, says Mushroom. Yet there was less fighting in the streets than most expected, with only 3 men killed. Mayhaps the lords of the realm had finally grown weary of war.
Every good dance needs an afterparty, and this was a dance that would never be forgotten, and the accompanying afterparty was no less memorable or important.
In past episodes, we've talked about historic parallels from English and classical history, specifically the Wars of the Roses, the anarchy, and the concept of a Pyrrhic victory in parts 1 through 3. In part 4, we also made the case for a strong literary parallel with William Butler Yeats's poem The Second Coming and Chinua Achebe's novel Things Fall Apart, which took its title from a line in the Yeats poem.
In parts 5 and 6, we left real-world comparisons aside because our primary focus was dragons, specifically the deaths of the Targaryen dragons and what it meant for the dynasty, followed by a tight focus on the utter devastation that House Targaryen, the human dragons, brought upon itself over the course of their internecine struggle, as Gildane terms the dance.
Today we have a final inspiration to take from real-world history, more a concept than an actual event, but one that's particularly fitting to the events described in this episode. Stay tuned to hear more about that time when future First Lady of the newly formed USA, Abigail Adams, implored her husband to remember the ladies.
As this episode unfolds, we'd all be well advised to do the same.
Hello and welcome to the 7th and final installment of Radio Westeros plus History of Westeros, covering the Dance of the Dragons. When we started this journey 5 years ago, little did we know that our series would be overtaken by not 1 but 2 seasons of the dance brought to the small screen in HBO's House of the Dragon. However, this series has been and still is about the dance as related in Fire and Blood, and so, as many months as it took us to get here, we arrive at the denouement much sooner than the TV show will. Within this episode, we'll cover everything that happened from the death of Aegon the Elder through the coronation of his last living rival, Aegon the Younger, and the subsequent marriage of Aegon III to his predecessor's last surviving child, Princess Jaehaera. All of this took place over a few short weeks in the middle of the year 131 AC, as what would be a long Westerosi winter took hold of the realm. We might almost have called this episode 4 Weddings and a Funeral, were it not for the fact that several of the dynastic marriages that resulted from this period took place off-page and in the future. But there is a funeral, one that filled people with a strange hope, and one uniquely joyless wedding that we can report on. So instead, we'll call it the after party, because as we've mentioned, every good dance deserves an after party. But first, we want to take a moment to thank our patrons. Both of our podcasts are supported by patrons, and in addition to benefits like shoutouts and early release, patrons have access to exclusive content, including a joint episode all about the wartime escapades of the Red Kraken, Lord Dalton Greyjoy. Find us both at patreon.com, and thanks again to the following patrons:
Flaming Lightbringer patron TJ Harrington, Dragonsteel patron Peter, and Pale as Milk Glass patrons Alex, Akka and the Company of the Cats, Chris B, The Song of Ice, Seth, Kelly, Sister Winter, Multude, MT Walls, first of his name, and John Wergarian, as well as B-Word and Mr. J, the Bear in the Maiden Fair, and Sir Tim of House Jibjab, Hot Dog Shop, house motto, "We forge the chains we wear in life."
The afterparty.
As we detailed last time, the Battle of the King's Road, also known as the Muddy Mess, was the final battle of the war. Though, as we see in this episode, it was a close-run thing, and events nearly led to a much longer conflict. Peace was in reach, but after so much death and destruction, so much bitter war, if it wasn't done right, the peace would be fragile and thus short-lived. King's Landing was a city ravaged by war, its populace hopelessly scarred and brutalized. The death of Aegon II might have brought hope that the end of their nightmare was in sight, but there were still quite a few things that needed to be sorted out.
Aegon the Elder's death left his nephew Aegon the Younger as his presumed heir, but the Green Council was still nominally in charge. That the council included people who had lately advocated for the death or mutilation of the new king, as well as the very people suspected of arranging the death of the late king, including Corlys Velaryon, who had been Rhaenyra's hand and principal supporter, hardly lent it much legitimacy. As the capital balanced on a razor's edge, several long-expected allies of the Black began to arrive in the Crownlands. First, from the Riverlands would come the lads and their army. They would be closely followed by Lord Cregan Stark and his Winterwolves, who would in turn be followed by Lady Jane Arryn and the Army of the Vale.
It would be a tumultuous time as lords and ladies jostled for power, influence, and, above all, solutions to any number of complicated problems. The quest for peace and justice at the end of this long and brutal war called diplomacy, and not a little bit of common sense. The biggest question on many people's minds in the hours and days after Aegon the Elder's death may have been who exactly was left that could provide that sort of leadership. As we'll see, in the end, the situation called for a coalition of leaders, some of whom would arise from unlikely places.
The false dawn. The circumstances under which the boy king began his reign were far from auspicious. The river lords who had broken Aegon II's last army at the Battle of the King's Road marched to King's Landing prepared for battle. Instead, Lord Corlys Velaryon and Prince Aegon rode forth to meet them under a peace banner. "The king is dead. Long live the king," Lord Corlys said, as he yielded up the city to their mercy.
Gyldayn refers to the reign of Aegon III as melancholy, and describes the man he became as enigmatic, a shadowy monarch who said little and did less, and lived a life steeped in grief and melancholy. A joyless man who apparently took no pleasure from life, including in his eventual 5 children. Grand Maester Munkin referred to him as the Broken King, and the small folk called him unlucky, unhappy, and Dragonbane.
None of these monikers should come as any surprise, given what Aegon had lived through in the first decade of his young life. The death of his grandfather Viserys, which led to the fracturing of his family and the violent deaths of nearly every one of the Greens who opposed his mother, including 2 of their children, younger than himself. Then there was the death of his elder brother Jacaerys and his dragon Vermax, as well as the loss of his younger brother Viserys at the Battle of the Gullet, not to mention his own terrifying flight to safety on his dying dragon Stormcloud during the same battle. There were the deaths of both his brother Lucerys and his dragon, and his father Daemon and his dragon, at the hands of his uncle Aemond and the fearsome Vhagar, which bookended the war. The terrifying riot in King's Landing, which led to the death of his brother Joffrey and the slaughtering of his house's dragons, symbol of their status and power, at the storming of the Dragon Pit. The frantic flight from the capital with his mother that ensued, and probably most significantly, the death of his mother at the hands of her own brother, who fed her to his wounded dragon Sunfire as Aegon was forced to watch.
While his half-sisters Baela and Rhaena would recover from their own trauma, and Rhaena even hatched a new dragon, the beautiful pink she-dragon whose name Morning could be seen as symbolic of the end of the war, Aegon would, for the rest of his days, be terrified of dragons and would forbid Morning from his presence when he was at last reunited with his sisters.
When his uncle died in 131 AC, Aegon was 10 years old, tall for his age, and had, quote, silver hair so pale that it was almost white, and purple eyes so dark they were almost black. So the typical Targaryen look. Mushroom notes that he smiled seldom and laughed less, and Gyldayn comments on a darkness within him that never went away. His own life had, for the past several months, been under repeated threat from his uncle and the Greens, and was saved most recently by the intervention of his kinsman, Lord Corlys Velaryon. That same uncle was now dead at the hands of an unknown poisoner, and though the adults who investigated the crime logically assumed that the poisoning had been done on behalf of the blacks at court, it's entirely possible that the child Aegon saw only yet another violent death visited upon a member of his family.
It was this gravely damaged child who rode out with Lord Corlys to meet the army of the Riverlands and be presented to its leaders as the new king. Those leaders who had ridden south ostensibly to bring the battle to the remaining Greens in the capital were little more than children themselves. Lord Kermit Tully was 19, green as summer grass, and his younger brother Oscar was even greener, though he had acquitted himself well at the Muddy Mess, as the Battle of the King's Road was being called by the victorious Riverlords. With them rode Lord Benjicott Blackwood, at 13 the youngest of the lads and closest in age to the new king. He had taken up the leadership of his house when his father fell to Amos Bracken at the Battle of the Burning Mill early in the war, and had developed a reputation for ferocity on the battlefield, and the nickname Bloody Ben. It was he who led the flank attack that had broken Lord Baratheon's army on the King's Road.
Once the Riverlords had knelt to Aegon and sworn their loyalties, the Sea Snake led them back to the city, where they were greeted by the cheering crowds due a victorious army. Small folk cheered, pretty girls threw flowers and kisses, and the gold cloaks lining the streets saluted them with lowered spears. Gildane suggests that Lar Strong had organized the spectacle. If so, it would be one of the final official acts of the Clubfoot as Master of Whispers for the crown. For even among the fetid Riverlanders, there were those who whispered uneasily about the manner of Aegon the Elder's death, Benjicott Blackwood and his aunt Alysanne prominent among them.
The Riverlords proceeded to the throne room of the Red Keep, where the body of Aegon II lay in state, with his mother, the Dowager Queen Alicent, weeping nearby. Also present were Lord Lars Strong, Grand Maester Orwyle, Sir Perkin the Flea, Mushroom, Septon Eustace, Sir Giles Belgrave, and 4 other Kingsguard, as well as numerous lesser lords and knights who had made up Aegon's court. We're told that Orwyle addressed the newcomers and hailed them as deliverers.
No one mentions what Alicent might have thought of that particular proclamation, given the new arrivals represented the destruction of the Greens' final hopes of prevailing in the field. And in fact, the Black victory appeared to be complete, with all of Aegon's remaining supporters in the east yielding to them. Duskendale on the shores of Blackwater Bay to Lord Leowyn Corbray and 5,000 Valemen. Maidenpool at the mouth of the Trident to his brother Sir Corwin with the remainder of the Vale army. And Dragonstone, after a brief siege, yielded to Alan Valerian and the men of Driftmark. Rosby and Stokeworth, those beleaguered castles who had been forced by violence to change loyalties several times during the war, replaced Aegon the Elder's golden dragon standard with the traditional red dragon of House Targaryen.
Septon Eustace mentions a strange euphoria setting over the capital, while Mushroom cuts to the chase by reporting that half the city was drunk. Celebrators reveled in the streets, while in the Red Keep preparations were made for Aegon the Elder's body to be consigned to the flames. All involved hoped that the burning of a king whose brief reign had engendered such death and devastation would symbolize the end to all the conflict that had consumed the realm, and thousands came to Aegon's High Hill in the aftermath of the funeral to hear Aegon the Younger proclaim that peace and a new dawn were at hand.
There were still those who might have found the celebrations taking place around the burning of a dead king an ill omen for the new king, while others would perhaps call it an appropriate beginning for a Targaryen king whose predecessor had caused the death of his mother by dragonflame. But just as no one spoke about what should be done about the Dowager Queen, anyone who doubted the appropriateness of these festivities or felt they were ill-omened remained silent.
The victors began planning a coronation, which would be followed by a wedding, as Aegon and his cousin Princess Jaehaera would be married to symbolize the end of the conflict within House Targaryen. Corlys Velaryon was busy with quill and parchment, sending messages to the remaining Greens across the Reach, Westerlands, and Stormlands, offering full pardons and safe conduct to all who would come to King's Landing to bend their knees to the new king.
Everything seemed to be coming up roses, and the prospect of a lasting peace led to nearly 2 weeks of celebration and good fellowship. But near the end of the fortnight following Aegon the Elder's death, word came that Lord Cregan Stark was approaching the city with his winter wolves, and the period historians would call the False Dawn came to a sudden end.
A heady time, no doubt, but short-lived, for when Lord Cregan Stark arrived before King's Landing with his Northmen, the frolics ended, and the happy plans came crashing down. The Hour of the Wolf. The Lord of Winterfell was 23, only a few years older than the Lords of Raventree and Riverrun. Yet Stark was a man and they were boys, as all those who saw them together seemed to sense. The lads shrank in his present, Mushroom says. Whenever the Wolf of the North stalked into a room, Bloody Ben would recall that he was but 3 and 10, whilst Lord Tully and his brother blustered and stammered and flushed red as their hair.
Westeros doesn't use the term a clock, in part because, well, they don't have clocks. Instead of numbers, they use names. The Hour of the Bat, which is just after sunset, the Hour of the Eel, which comes next, or the Hour of the Wolf, the blackest part of night. It wasn't so dark metaphorically, though. It was the true night, not the kind Sansa dreamt of as a younger person, but the kind of night that is followed by a true dawn, unlike the false dawn just described. The Hour of the Wolf is also the nickname given to the brief reign of Lord Cregan Stark as Hand of the King during the end of the Dance of the Dragons. He had made a promise to Prince Jacaerys and carried forward the oath of his own father, Lord Rickon, who swore an oath to King Viserys that he would recognize Rhaenyra as his heir.
Rhaenyra's death didn't absolve him of that oath, the way Cregan saw it, nor did the death of Jacaerys. Lord Stark probably also saw that his army was by far the strongest. The southern armies had torn each other to shreds. The victors were his allies, and most importantly, perhaps, there were no dragons to be concerned with. The dragons weren't extinct. Not yet. That wouldn't come for 25 years or so, but they were no longer a military threat. Cregan's Northmen were more fearsome and more numerous, with no one capable of standing against him, and he knew it.
King's Landing had welcomed the Riverlords and their men with feasts and flowers and honours. Not so the Northmen. There were more of them for a start, a host twice as large as those the lads had led, and with a fearsome repute. In their mail shirts and shaggy fur cloaks, their features hidden behind thick tangles of beard, they swaggered through the city like so many armoured bears, says Mushroom. Most of what King's Landing knew of Northmen they had learned from Sir Medric Manderley and his brother Sir Torren. Courtly men, well-spoken, handsomely clad, well-disciplined, and godly. The Winterfell men did not even honour the true gods, Septon Eustace notes with horror. They scorned the Seven, ignored the feast days, mocked the holy books, showed no reverence to Septon or Scepter, worshipped trees.
They were eager for him to be gone, but they couldn't exactly force him out, nor would he do so of his own accord until he accomplished his goals. And though he had no designs on King's Landing or power in general, he was definitely looking for a fight. You see, his intent was not to use his greater strength as a means of peace. In fact, he was fully ready to prolong the war to satisfy the demands of honor. He wanted his so-called armored bears to march on the major seats of the Greens to punish them directly, to see them bend the knee, whatever it took.
Others had started this war, Lord Cregan was heard to say, but he meant to finish it, to continue south and destroy all that remained of the Greens who had placed Aegon II on the Iron Throne and fought to keep him there. He would reduce Storm's End first, then cross the Reach to take Old Town. Once the High Tower had fallen, he would take his wolves north along the shores of the Sunset Sea to visit Casterly Rock.
Casterly Rock had never fallen. Even Queen Visenya expressed gratitude that the events of the conquest never made that particular battle necessary. Yet not only did Lord Stark propose taking it, he proposed taking it after first taking several other nearly impregnable castles. For instance, let's not forget how Stannis held Storm's End against a much larger army during Robert's Rebellion and later used assassination to avoid having to assault it himself. Old Town is massive, and the High Tower itself could never fall without a bloody and bitter struggle. But Cregan wanted to take both of those castles before Casterly Rock. All three of them. It was borderline madness, and some said so. But they had every reason to believe that Lord Cregan was serious, despite the audacity of his plan.
It's an intriguing question for us as well. Was Lord Cregan simply taking an extreme stance as a bargaining position, a means to overpower and intimidate? Or would he truly have marched on all 3 seats, given the chance? Before marching on the Greens, however, he meant to clean up his own side. Though no one seemed to know it at the time, Lord Cregan likely never intended on staying long in King's Landing. His men scared the locals. Rumors began that he would burn the septs, throw his enemies in pits to be devoured by wolves, and a new shepherd arose, preaching against the Northmen and their worship of trees.
There had also been incidents of fighting between Stark and Tully men. A brothel burned down and a son of Lord Hornwood vanished, rumored to have wound up in a bowl of brown. Clearly it was much better for all if the Hour of the Wolf was truly a matter of hours and days rather than weeks or months. But Lord Cregan had specific and important goals to accomplish before departing. Surely he never intended to return again, at least not during the war. Though fear of him and his men could harm their own cause in the long term, it could work to Cregan's advantage in the short term. If he got what he wanted, he would leave, and everyone knew that.
Still, despite having both the stronger personality and the stronger army, he didn't get what he wanted. Not at first, anyway. The first to oppose his march was the Sea Snake himself, who had been focused on peace for some time now. And as we've mentioned, he had already made peace overtures to many of these houses, who would in turn accept, as we'll see later. But that was not yet known. And from Lord Stark's perspective, Lord Corlys had changed sides, acted illegally and dishonorably, and was thus not to be trusted. Nor were several other members of the council. Given he had full military control of the Red Keep, however, he didn't have to trust them.
Then Stark's men burst into the council chambers, disarmed the guardsmen at the door, pulled the aged Sea Snake from his chair, and dragged him to the dungeons. There he would soon be joined by Larys Strong the Clubfoot, Grand Maester Orwyle, Sir Perkin the Flea, and Septon Eustace, along with 100 others, both high-born and low, that Stark found cause to mistrust.
Mushroom feared that he would be imprisoned as well, but he was left alone, and his freedom is notable. This quote tells us that both Eustace and Orwyle were imprisoned, and those are 2 of the most important eyewitness sources for the Dance of the Dragons. With their imprisonment, the story relies even more on the Dwarf Jester for this portion, since he is now the only eyewitness of the group, and would be for as long as Eustace and Orwyle remained in their cells.
As we pointed out earlier, Cregan was not likely ever interested in staying in King's Landing for an extended time. He had a campaign to conduct, and winter was coming. As well, there were other armies on the march. The largest was that of the Vale, which finally got moving at 15,000 strong. This was not an enemy army, to be sure. The North and the Vale were both supporters of the Blacks, but it is unlikely they would see eye to eye on the governance of the realm at this point.
If the army of the Vale reached the city, it would be a check on his power, especially given they were bringing Princess Rhaena and her hatchling mourning, an important symbol of power for House Targaryen. Having his Northmen barge in and seize members of the council wouldn't have been so easy if the Red Keep were filled with Vale men, or if Rhaena openly opposed him. So, Cregan might have been wielding power swiftly out of necessity, as well as because he had other places to be.
Out of so many, is it possible Lord Cregan jailed some who were innocent? He wasn't exactly there during the war to personally take note of who was loyal and who wasn't. That said, there was little reaction to the imprisonments of so many. For the most part, this was because those imprisoned did not come from powerful families. Most were not even nobles, such as Sir Perkin the Flea, and likely most, if not all, of the unnamed prisoners. There were 2 exceptions on the list, however, Larys Strong and Corlys Velaryon.
Lord Larys came from a powerful family, but thanks in large part to his own murderous actions, he was the only male Strong left. Prince Daemon had captured the wealth of Harrenhal when he seized the castle at the outset of the war, nor did Larys have any loyal followers or armies to stand for him. So actually, in truth, he wasn't much of an exception after all, and he was condemned to die, and no reprieve seemed to be incoming, despite his high birth and station. But Lord Corlys was another matter altogether. His heir, Alan, controlled the Valyrian fleet, which was significantly reduced in strength, but was still the only navy of note in the area. And it was no longer threatened by dragons.
Nor was it ever threatened by armored bears. Lord Stark was not particularly threatened by the Valyrian fleet either. A blockade would not be effective as they could bring in food by land, and planned to depart for Storm's End in short order anyhow. In general, Alan Velaryon could be a problem, so many tried to dissuade Cregan from this course of action, but none were successful. Cregan didn't see the threat of Alan as a sufficient reason to abandon justice as he saw it. Lord Stark also knew that Alan couldn't stop him from executing the Sea Snake.
And perhaps that would be better in a certain light. Let Alan have a grudge against House Stark rather than House Targaryen. Roose Bolton once responded to Jaime Lannister saying that Lannister enmity meant little to Bolton, and he was referring to the great distance between the two houses geographically. Well, the same is true here. House Velaryon, despite their might, is little threat to landlocked northerly Winterfell. For Lord Cregan, though, it probably wasn't that deep. His duty was to mete out justice, consequences, or political considerations be damned. This is an intense and stubborn young man we're talking about. Nor were the even younger lads making any progress in convincing him to back down on his campaign. Not even a little. He continued to dominate.
Stark berated them. Who told you the war was done? The clubfoot, the snake? Why, because they wish it done. Because you won your little victory in the mud. Wars end when the defeated bend the knee and not before. Has Oldtown yielded? Has Casterly Rock returned the crown's gold? You say you mean to marry the prince to the king's daughter, yet she remains at Storm's End, beyond your reach. So long as she remains free and unwed, what is to stop Baratheon's widow from crowning the girl queen as Aegon's heir?
Harsh, but it's a strong point he makes. The lads argued, pointing out that the Greens had no strength left. But Cregan countered, saying that both Rhaenyra and Aegon II had made the mistake of thinking themselves victorious, of celebrating too soon, and look what happened to them. He told them they were making the same mistake, and they eventually yielded to his overpowering argument and pledged to add their strength to his own when they marched. Cregan had another advantage, one that asks us to remember what we were taught so early on in A Game of Thrones. He who controls the king controls the kingdom. Lord Stark made sure to keep a close watch and guard on young Aegon III. Most of the others barely had a chance to speak with the boy.
He also asked the boy to name him Hand of the King, which Aegon did. That gave Cregan supreme authority, the right to conduct trials, the right to execute even other high lords, something he wouldn't have been able to do without being named Hand. This is a lot of power to give to any man, let alone one you barely know. It could have gone very badly.
But Lord Stark was no manipulator, no man to put words in the mouth of the young king. Others were, however. When Aegon's own half-sisters, the twins Baela and Rhaena, arrived in the city, they were among the few even allowed into Aegon's presence. The twins impressed upon him the need to pardon their grandfather, the Sea Snake, reminding Aegon III that it was Lord Corlys himself who saved the king from a maiming at the hands of Aegon II. The realm would be rid of Aemond One Eye, only to be ruled by Aegon One Ear.
Young Aegon was convinced and gave the order for the Sea Snake's release. But not only was he not yet anointed and crowned, he was only 10 years old. A king doesn't come into his full power traditionally until about the age 16, which meant that Lord Cregan, as Hand of the King, could override him or simply ignore his commands, much like Lord Tywin Lannister would do with his grandson Joffrey many years later. No word on whether Cregan sent Aegon to bed without any supper.
But let us remind ourselves as well that Lord Cregan himself had been ruled by a regent, one who did not relinquish power when he came of age. The thought of behaving as his own uncle had may have disgusted Lord Cregan. In other words, it may have been personal as well as a matter of honor. Nevertheless, at first he appeared to reject the king's command. He didn't openly say no, but he didn't obey either. Behind the scenes, we're told he resisted numerous entreaties, threats, and pleas to no avail. The king's command would have been ignored, but something changed his mind.
Interestingly, Lord Cregan also showed forbearance in the matter of what he was owed. He had befriended Prince Jacaerys, who had promised his house a Targaryen princess. Yes, an actual princess that was promised. The North must have remembered this. But there's no Targaryen princess to marry at this moment other than Jaehaera, who of course was already spoken for. So, no such princess existed, nor would one, as it turned out, for another 14 years. And when that day came and that girl was born, Lord Stark himself had no sons. Ultimately, that's a tale for another time, but the full story doesn't reveal to us why he let this one go. or why that promise remained unfulfilled.
However, both of these questions, that of letting young Aegon's order to free the sea snake stand, and his forbearance on the promised princess, may share an answer. That answer was none other than Black Aly Blackwood, who agreed to become the Lady of Winterfell not long after Aegon's command. Though of royal blood, as the Blackwoods had been kings once long ago, she was not a princess. Though a lady, she was also a warrior, having distinguished herself during the war in multiple battles. More battles than Lord Cregan had fought, we might add. Others had taken note of his interest in her well before peace hung in the balance.
In King's Landing, whilst accompanying her young nephew Benjicot at court and council, she had met Cregan Stark and conceived a liking for the stern Northman, and Lord Cregan, a widower these past 3 years, had responded in kind. Though Black Aly was no man's queen of love and beauty, her fearlessness, stubborn strength, and bawdy tongue struck a chord for the Lord of Winterfell, who soon began to seek out her company in hall and yard.
Perhaps Lord Stark was so satisfied and grateful for his own new bride, whom he wouldn't have met if not for House Targaryen, in a manner of speaking, that he forgave the debt. Or maybe he intended on making the match much later, and it simply never came to pass, given he and Black Aly had only daughters. But there was also a promise involved in their marriage. Her words moved the wolf as much as her charm, and she had designs on more than his hand. It said that Lord Cregan would indeed have countermanded young Aegon's order, if not for Black Aly. Mushroom claims that she traded marriage to Lord Cregan for the sea snake's freedom, her hand for the sea snake's head. Her actions are all the more noble, given we're told she likely would have married Lord Cregan regardless. She had the rare chance to name her own dowry, and she chose peace.
Perhaps the bargain was not actually quite so simple, but it was certainly the end result. There was no longer conflict within the Black faction. For now. However, Lord Cregan still intended to march. He had conceded the matter of the sea snake, not that Casterly Rock, the High Tower, and Storm's End. Those lords must still face justice, and Lord Cregan was undeterred. There had been many changes of leadership, however, much of it thanks to the sheer number of lords who were killed during the dance, and their sons and grandsons and brothers and uncles too. In other words, many if not most of the guilty parties had already died, and were replaced by heirs or regents who did not carry on the war, and who bore no responsibility for prior treasons.
We must also not forget that leaders is a vague term, and the leader isn't always the one that holds the title of lord or lady or king or queen. Black Aly Blackwood herself didn't inherit Raventree Hall, for example, but can anyone doubt that her actions were those of a leader? Can anyone doubt that she wielded power over Lord Cregan, the hand of the king? Though not by force or threat, she got what she wanted from the most powerful man in King's Landing, and that included getting him to change his mind. The Red Keep got the wolf for the proverbial hour, but Black Aly got him for the rest of her life.
If peace is priceless, then her actions were invaluable. But she was not alone, nor did her actions suffice by themselves. This new crop of leaders may have been, as a group, young and inexperienced, but they had at least experienced war. They had lived through the dance of the dragons. Perhaps not all on the battlefield, but nevertheless the lessons would be formative.
And now, at the midpoint of the episode, it's time to thank our patrons. For History of Westeros, the Queen of Love and Beauty, from the depths of Flea Bottom, Lord Ken of House Hammer has declared for Queen Carrie, Fire of the North, who recovered Dark Sister from beyond the wall. The ship captains, Black Matos Stormrider, captain of the Rusted Hinge, Lord Chucklaz, captain of the Dromond Nightblood, destroyer of evil, John Gregor, captain of the Fist of the Drowned God, Sir Kieran of Lonely Light, scourge of the Sunset Sea, captain of Naga's Breath, a Dromond armed with siphons of wildfire, Aileen, Archer Queen, captain of the Border Collie, Crimson Kate, captain of the Drowned Queen's Vengeance, Jasana the Just, collector of tolls, captain of the Golden Gift, Beneath the Gold, a podcast focusing on lesser-known A Song of Ice and Fire characters, Prakash, the Lord Protector of the Gallifreyans, captain of TARDIS of the Seven Seas, Tempest of House Brewer, captain of the Summer Storm, Catherine the Cruel, captain of the Kraken's Claw, Lana Del Relea, Death Dreamer, captain of the Cyclopean Call, Nadia Storm, mother of worms and wyverns, captain of the Stygian Darkness, Hara Darkcharm, known as Lady Badluck, captain of the Black Cat and prowler of the seas. Nina the Airwave Nomad, captain of the Nuanced Nitwit, coaster of the currents. Lydia the Drowner, aka Lydia the Kraken, captain of Green Smile, a longship decorated with the rotting skulls of dead foes. Your secret Targaryen, captain of Boricua Machateros.
And from Radio Westeros' Valyrian Steel level, thanks to Aileen, Oxheart, Blythe Spirit, Archmaester Kobe of the Higher Mysteries, Kabeth the Unfrozen, Dean, Lord Sosa and his faithful canine companion Theoden, Dolorous Fred, Jill, J.M., Herbert Westeros the Miskatonic Maester, Lady Silverwing, Infaindaris the Unspeakable Terror, Mark, Boss, Schwartz the Black, the Sothorian, Sally, Tristis Lorien, Wild Child of the Wolfswood, W, Sword of the Evening, and Lady Direliz of Castle Naki, the Alpha Patron.
We have some new merch in our Threadless shop. We have these Dance of the Dragons tour poster style t-shirts. I mean, you could get them on other products if you so chose, or you could get them as a tour poster. They're blacks versus greens, and they list the various altercations of the Dance of the Dragons. So check that out at historyofwesteros.com at the shirts link, or you can go directly to historyofwesteros.threadless.com and tag us in any pictures of you in your new merch.
When women ruled, it was the women who made the peace. Black Hallie, the Maiden of the Vale, the Three Widows, the Dragon Twins. 'Twas them who brought the bloodshed to an end, and not with swords or poison, but with ravens, words, and kisses.
As we saw, when he arrived in King's Landing, Cregan Stark had scorned the lads and the lords at court for their insistence that the war was over. Not so, stated Lord Stark. As we've discussed, he intended to carry the war south and west to destroy the remaining Green supporters. While Green supporters in the east had already replaced the Golden Dragon of Aegon II with the traditional Red Dragon of House Targaryen and bent their knees to Aegon III, Storm's End, Old Town, and Casterly Rock remained at the top of Lord Cregan's list of Green holdouts that he intended to see destroyed. However, Gildane tells us that during the Fall's Dawn,
a cloud of ravens rose from the Red Keep, summoning the poisoned king's remaining loyalists to Old Town, the Reach, Casterly Rock, and Storm's End to King's Landing to do homage to their new monarch. Safe conducts were given, full pardons promised.
This was the work of Lord Corlys Velaryon, who sought to knit the realm back together with quills and ravens, much as Sir Otto Hightower had once hoped to secure his grandson's claim to the throne in the same way.
Of the many reasons Lord Corlys wished to see the conflict resolved peaceably, perhaps the most compelling was the deaths of the lords of the three principal holdings that Cregan Stark had designated for destruction. Small boys and suckling babes sit in their places now, no threat to us. Grant them honorable terms and they will bend the knee, he said. For Cregan Stark, this was no reason at all, and he pointed out the danger of small boys learning hate and a thirst for vengeance from their mothers, and growing up to become big problems for the throne. However, it turned out that Lord Cregan had reckoned without the character of the women who had held Westeros together while their husbands were at war.
Throughout history, women have kept up the home front during times of war. Historians have long noted that in times of social instability, the status and roles of women could change dramatically, with some incremental gains occasionally lingering well beyond the wartime periods. And so in our own world, we've seen women not only taking on combat and support roles at the front throughout history, but also working as factory workers during World War II, maintaining family businesses and running farms for absent husbands and fathers during the American Revolutionary and Civil Wars, and managing domestic economies during numerous periods of wartime shortages and boycotts, as well as using their influences with family and friends to affect outcomes in many other ways, great and small.
Women so empowered rarely returned meekly to submissive states, and so we see women like Abigail Adams, wife of American revolutionary and future President John Adams, encouraging her husband to, quote, remember the ladies who had worked so hard to further the cause of American liberty. A staunch proponent of women's rights, Abigail spent many years running the family businesses in Massachusetts while her husband traveled the country as a lawyer and revolutionary leader. Her view of a cooperative society where married women had equal protections under the law didn't lead to a revolution in women's rights so much as lay the foundation for future feminists to assert their opinions on a range of issues from property and voting rights to slavery and other humanitarian issues.
Considering that the primary issue behind the conflict that was just now ending in Westeros was the right of females to inherit lands and titles in their own right, Abigail Adams' plea to her husband feels quite pertinent to our topic.
No less than 4 of Westeros' famed 7 kingdoms, the Westerlands, Stormlands, Reach, and Vale, were now at least nominally ruled by women, not to mention Dorne, ruled by Princess Alejandra Martell, with strong women taking center stage in the Crown Lands and Riverlands as well. Perhaps we should also remember the ladies, in particular those women who held it all together in the very locations that Cragen Stark had noted down as candidates for destruction by his wild Northmen.
It turns out that not only were these women heartily sick of the war that had claimed their husbands, fathers, brothers, and sons' lives, they were also particularly loath to give up the power that had accrued to them as they managed all of the hardships that came their way during those months and years, from food shortages and diseases to restless small folk and aggressive neighbors. Thus, when many of the lords in King's Landing would have, quote, given us another 2 years of war, according to Mushroom, it was the ladies who said enough and saved the realm from further conflict, neutralizing Lord Cragen's threats in the process. Gildane tells us,
The seeds cast into the wind by Lord Corlys Velaryon during the false dawn had taken root and borne sweet fruit. One by one the ravens returned, bearing answers to the old man's peace offers.
First came the response from Lady Johanna Lannister. Lord Jason's widow had 5 daughters and 1 son, the 4-year-old Lord of the Rock, Lorien Lannister. For much of the past 2 years, while her husband marched to war in support of the Greens, Dalton Greyjoy of Pike had harried the coast of the Westerlands. This was initially done at the request of Rhaenyra Targaryen, who asked the Red Kraken, as young Dalton was known, to harass her enemies. Aegon the Elder had offered him the position of Master of Ships if he would just gather up all of his ships and sail around Westeros to the east coast. But Rhaenyra's request required much less from Lord Dalton and was designed to appeal to the Ironborn love of raiding and reaving.
Lady Joanna had barred the gates of Casterly Rock when the Greyjoy fleet arrived in Lannisport and so prevented the Ironborn from gaining access to the rock. But they had still managed to burn the Lannister fleet and sack the port, after which they carried off dozens of women and continued reaving up and down the coast. In response to the Sea Snake's letter, Lady Johanna promised to come to the capital for Aegon's coronation and to deliver 2 of her daughters to serve as companions to Jaehaera in the age-old Westerosi tradition of offering hostages as a guarantee of loyalty. She also agreed to return the part of the royal treasury that had been sent to the Rock for safekeeping by her husband's twin brother Sir Tyland, so long as Sir Tyland himself was granted full pardon. In exchange, she asked a boon of the Iron Throne. Command Lord Greyjoy to crawl back to his islands, restore Fair Isle to its rightful lords, and free all the women he has carried off, or at least all those of noble birth.
In the end, the Iron Throne wouldn't have much to do with ending the depredations of the Red Kraken. And, spoiler, it was another woman. But that's a story for another day and another episode. And patrons of History Westeros and Radio Westeros won't have too long to wait, as we do plan to complete part 2 of our patron-exclusive Red Kraken v. Johanna Lannister coverage in the near future.
Meanwhile, in the Stormlands, Lady Elenda Baratheon had given birth to her husband's first and only son a mere 7 days after his death in the Riverlands. Though Lord Boros had asked that his heir be named Aegon for the king he died supporting, Lady Elenda made a potent and defiant statement when she instead named the baby Royce, after her father, Lord Royce Caron of Nightsong.
Upon receiving Lord Corlys's message and noting that the defeated remnants of her husband's army who had returned to the Stormlands had really lost their belly for conflict, Lady Elenda agreed to the terms. While she herself couldn't travel due to her recent childbirth, she stated that she would send her father, Lord Caron, to do homage in her stead, along with 3 of her daughters to serve as hostages. In addition, accompanying Lord Caron and the Baratheon girls would be Sir Willis Fell of the Kingsguard and his, quote, precious charge, 8-year-old Jaehaera Targaryen, last descendant of Alicent Hightower and Viserys I, and future wife of the new king.
Some of you might recall that Lord and Lady Baratheon had 4 daughters, known collectively as the Four Storms. Arranging marriages for his daughters was something that seemed to be a prime motivator for Lord Boros, and we've commented on that aspect of his personality in past installments. In fact, relatively recently, during the meeting we've called the Secret Council that led to the end of the Moon of the Three Kings, Boros had spoken of having 4 marriageable daughters.
You might also recall that meeting took place between Queen Alicent, Grand Maester Orwyle, Lord Larys, and Lord Boros on the south bank of the Blackwater Rush, and that in it, Lord Boros secured betrothals for his eldest daughter, Cassandra, to Aegon the Elder, and another of his girls, Floris, to the Clubfoot. He then offered a choice of either of his 2 daughters, not yet spoken for, as bait for Lord Corlys Velaryon, suggesting perhaps the old man would like a new young wife.
Those other 2 daughters were Ellen and Maris. While Lady Olenda's letter makes no mention of which 3 girls would be sent to the capital, we do get clarification a little later when Gyldayn summarizes the guests who eventually arrived in King's Landing for the coronation. Cassandra, Ellen, and Floris were sent as representatives of House Baratheon, he tells us, adding,
Maris, the 4th daughter, had joined the Silent Sisters, Septon Eustace informs us. In Mushroom's account, this was done after her lady mother had her tongue removed, but that grisly detail can be safely discounted. The persistent belief that the Silent Sisters are tongueless is no more than a myth. It is piety that keeps the sisters silent, not red-hot pincers.
We think we'd side with Eustace on the matter of tongue removal, since religious vows of silence are actually relatively common and seem altogether more valuable than a macabre and disfiguring ritual would be. But what catches our eye here is the why of it. And this doesn't seem to have been Lord Boros's plan, since he was trying to marry Maris off mere days before his own death. So what gives? Did Maris choose silence, or did her mother command it? And the answer might just lie in something from the early days of the conflict. In fact, something that could be viewed as one of several sparks that led to the conflict between the Blacks and the Greens becoming all-out war.
It's something we talked about all the way back in the 2nd installment of this series. When Lucerys went to Storm's End to negotiate with Lord Boros on behalf of his mother, he had a rather famous and unfortunate run-in with his uncle Aemond One-Eye. Lord Boros had attempted, perhaps somewhat weakly, to assert the principle of guest right, to prevent the 2 from coming to blows under his roof. But after Luke departed the hall, we reported the following.
And there it might have ended, but for Lord Boros's 2nd daughter. Maris had been noted to be the cleverest of the 4 girls, but also the least attractive. Aemond clearly hadn't chosen her as his bride, and perhaps she was angry about that. Or perhaps, being clever and female, she was angry at her father's choice of alliance. Whatever her reasons, her words to Aemond can only be described as goading. Was it one of your eyes he took, or one of your balls? I'm so glad you chose my sister. I want a husband with all his parts. Seething with rage and humiliation, Aemond requested Lord Boros's leave to depart. Although the outcome must have been writ plain as day, Lord Boros could only shrug and say, "It's not for me to tell you what to do when you're not beneath my roof."
We all know what happened next, and that it's pretty clear that the brutal death of her son was the event that pushed Rhaenyra to the point of no return. The fact that it could plausibly be laid at the feet of Maris Baratheon might have convinced Lady Elenda to not send her 2nd daughter to Aegon's court. But the fact that Maris, a clever girl, was so outspoken that her words might have indirectly led to the death of thousands, including her own father, might be considered reason enough for her mother to force her into an organization where she would be poetically forbidden to ever use that voice again as a punishment. Whatever the reason, Maris Baratheon, Lord Boros' clever 2nd daughter, joined the Silent Sisters and was never heard from again.
And getting back to King's Landing, there came at last a message from Old Town. And for obvious reasons, the Hightowers had been Aegon the Elder's earliest and most powerful supporters. They remained a significant threat, for not only could their potential power on land and sea threaten the new king's coalition, but they still retained possession of a quarter of the royal treasury that had been sent to the Hightower for safety. With this gold, they could hire sellswords or bribe potential allies. There was almost certainly no response whose arrival was anticipated with greater apprehension than that of the new Lord Hightower.
Not unlike House Lannister and Baratheon, House Hightower had lost their lord in the dance. Lord Ormond fell at Tumbleton, and his title passed to the eldest of three sons, Lionel. However, where the new Lord Lannister was but 4 years old and Lord Baratheon was a newborn baby, Lord Lionel was 15, just shy of manhood. And unlike the others, he didn't have a mother serving as his regent. He did, however, have a stepmother.
Lady Samantha Tarly was Lord Ormond's second wife, married just before the dance began. Sam was the daughter of Lord Donald Tarly and his wife, Lady Jane Rowan, both members of houses who had notably supported Rhaenyra. Furthermore, Lady Sam was noted to be fierce and fiery and beautiful and strong-willed. She was also only 2 years older than her stepson, and according to Gildane, had no intention of giving up her place as the Lady of Oldtown and Mistress of the Hightower.
However, we'd suggest that the highly intelligent Lady Sam saw which way the wind was blowing and acted to save her families and the Reach from another extended period of bloodshed just as winter was setting in. Consider that her own family were blacks who would no doubt find themselves at war again, and still in opposition to her late husband's family, which must certainly have been an uncomfortable position to be in those past 2 years. Add to that the fact that the late Lord Ormond's youngest son was at Highgarden, where he served as a cupbearer to Lady Tyrell and companion to the 4-year-old Lord Lionel Tyrell.
While Lady Tyrell had so far managed to stay out of the war, with the blacks in the ascendancy and likely to be aided by numerous powerful houses in the Reach, there were absolutely no guarantees that she would continue to do so. In which case, the youngest Hightower boy would be extremely well placed as a hostage. So, while it's certainly possible that Lady Sam simply enjoyed being the Lady of Oldtown, it seems much more likely that she wished to prevent conflict that at this point would seem almost guaranteed to tear apart not only her families, who found themselves still on opposite sides of the divide, but the entire Reach.
It was Mushroom who said in his testimony that it was, quote, the women who brought peace to the realm and that they did so with ravens, words, and kisses. In Lady Sam's case, as we saw with Black Alley, kisses, or the promise of kisses, would be the major factor. Because Mushroom also states that young Lord Lionel had been infatuated with his stepmother since she had arrived in Old Town a few years previously. And so when young Lionel apparently ripped Lord Corlys's letter into bits and threatened bloody retribution, Lady Sam evidently decided to take matters, and him, in hand.
We're told that she allowed her stepson to seduce her and promised to marry him, but only on the condition that he make peace. Lord Lionel, faced with a choice between peace and a beautiful young wife or vengeance and more war and destruction, evidently chose the wife. To the surprise of his family, Lord Lionel agreed to the Sea Snake's terms, including the return of the crown's gold. That in itself was problematic, since a cousin of Lionel's had apparently helped himself to a large portion of the cash. And we're not told what Sir Miles Hightower's position was, or how the missing gold was compensated, but the fact that Miles was furious might be a hint that the compensation wasn't going to be drawn from Lord Lionel's personal treasury.
And then, after his response was sent to King's Landing, Lionel announced his intention of marrying his father's widow. The scandal was such that the High Septon refused to allow the marriage, and when Lionel defiantly kept Lady Sam by his side as his mistress, the High Septon refused to travel with the pair to the capital for Aegon's coronation. No matter, they simply traveled separately, and all arrived safely, and for what it's worth, Lionel and Sam stayed together and had 6 children over the next 13 years, before a new, more agreeable High Septon finally agreed to bless their union.
And so it would appear that with those 3 messages, all of the largest problems of the realm were solved. Gold was to be returned to the treasury, peace was at hand, and former enemies were coming willingly to King's Landing to bend their knees and witness the marriage and coronation of Aegon III and his little queen, Jaehaera Targaryen. But Mushroom mentions a number of other women who had a positive impact on the peace at hand, and we'd be remiss if we didn't mention all of them.
We've already discussed Black Aly's bargain with Cregan Stark for Corlys Velarion's life, a hand for a head. And if that offer seems to work both ways, we have to commend Aly for her sly wit. But Alysanne Blackwood wouldn't stop at saving the life of the Sea Snake, and the fragile new peacetime coalition to boot. As we'll see, she would also prove instrumental in solving one of Cregan Stark's trickiest problems: what to do about the winter wolves who had ridden south with him at the onset of winter, with no intention of ever returning to the north. And more on that shortly.
From the Vale, Lord Leowyn Corbray and his brother Sir Corwyn had been key in regaining control of the Crown lands. Their liege, Lady Jane Arryn, kinswoman to the young king, had arrived in King's Landing aboard a ship from Gulltown along with her ward, Lady Rhaena Targaryen, and Rhaena's newly hatched dragon, Morning. It was Lady Arryn who joined the ruling coalition at court and convinced Lord Cregan that Rhaena and her twin sister Baela should be allowed to visit their brother the king. And as we mentioned, it was those visits, minus the horrifying, to Aegon, Pink Dragon, that convinced the young king to issue a decree pardoning and sparing the life of their grandfather, Lord Corlys. This decree would be the point on which Alysanne Blackwood first approached Lord Cregan, and so Lady Jane and the twins were all enormously influential in that resolution.
And we can't fail to mention the tremendous popularity of Baela and Rhaena with the small folk. Though Gildane dryly points out that those same small folk had, quote, not a year before, slaughtered every dragon in the city, they were apparently overcome with joy at the sight of the hatchling riding on Rhaena's shoulder. The twins became, quote, the darlings of the city overnight, perhaps unsurprising in a population that had been so traumatized by poor leadership, war, famine, and violence.
Many years later, a Maester Abelon would write a treatise titled When Women Ruled, Ladies of the Aftermath, in which he chronicled the hundreds of widows who managed estates great and small on behalf of their dead husbands, fathers, brothers, or their fatherless children after the war. Among these women, Abelon specifically mentions several of those we've already discussed, to whom we would also add Lady Sabitha Frey, who led armies to battle on behalf of her son after her husband died at the battle on the lakeshore, and who no doubt continued to rule the twins during his minority, as well as that Lady Tyrell, who, as the infant Lord Lionel Tyrell's regent, declined to enter the war at all on account of being a mere woman, thus preserving House Tyrell and Highgarden from wartime loss and devastation. Abelon also names Lady Sharis Footley, who took charge of Tumbleton in her young son's name after the war, and Alice Rivers at Harrenhal.
While it's outside the scope of this episode, since Alice didn't have any role to play in the aftermath of the war as it pertained to King's Landing or the succession of Aegon III, we mention it because she had been so prominent in the stories of Aemond and Daemon, as well as the fact that within a couple of years, she would establish herself at Harrenhal with a child she claimed was Aemond's true-born son, and therefore Aegon II's true heir, as well as, according to some witnesses, a dragon. Other than some apparent sorcery that we won't get into here, we learn nothing else about Alice and her son, or the dragon. Hopefully these are things that will be addressed in greater detail one day in Blood and Fire, because we really need to know more about that dragon.
At any rate, midway through the year 131, thanks to the influence of a number of prominent ladies, it seemed as though peace was now truly coming to Westeros. After 2 long years of conflict and devastation, surely the time for healing both the realm and its leading family was at hand. As with any such solutions, though, the reality would be less fairy tale and more gritty realism. And there was still one prominent woman in the realm who wasn't ready for healing or reconciliation, and neither Cregan Stark nor any of the other lords assembled at court had any particular advice on how to deal with her. They were focused on other matters, anyhow.
The Judgment of the Wolf. Here and there throughout the realm, a few stubborn loyalists still flew Aegon II's golden dragon, but they were of little significance. The dance was done, the others all agreed. It was time to make the peace and set the realm to rights. On one point, Lord Cregan remained adamant, however. The king's killers must not go unpunished. Unworthy as King Aegon II might have been, his murder was high treason, and those responsible must answer for it.
Justice is blind, some would say, and blindness can be a metaphor for darkness, and before the light can return, justice must be done. Because we're dealing with the Stark of Winterfell, we're not surprised that he took a hardline stance. Most leaders would not accuse their own allies of treason for killing the enemy king, but that's exactly what he did.
It's also exactly what Cregan's great-great-great-great-grandson Ned would do during another Westerosi civil war when he took exception to Jaime Lannister killing Mad King Aerys. It took him 14 years to fully express his thoughts about Jaime's actions during the sack of King's Landing to Robert Baratheon. And though he held back the opinion that those actions had tainted Robert's claim to the throne, Ned did eventually think those words at exactly the right moment for us readers to witness them. Perhaps Ned was thinking about his famous ancestor, who also served his hand to the king, when he recalled how the dishonorable slaughter of an enemy can leave a permanent stain.
And to be fair, similar to Jaime, a Knight of the Kingsguard, killing Aerys, it wasn't just that the Blacks killed Aegon in general. After all, as Robert said about Aerys, someone had to kill him. The problem was how they killed him. Aegon should have been defeated in battle, removed honorably, not by poison. Also, because he's a Stark of Winterfell, we should remember that, quote, he who passes the sentence should swing the sword. That's how they operate, and Cregan was no exception to that tradition. In fact, he was more than ready to swing that huge sword ice.
But first, he conducted trials and investigations. He sat on a simple wooden bench at the foot of the Iron Throne and set out to question the prisoners. In some cases, that meant torture. Septon Eustace was first. He was judged innocent and set free, and presumably resumed his place as an eyewitness to the remainder of the aftermath. Orwyle was condemned for supplying the poison, even though he claimed not to know who it was for. Cregan's response to that was he should have asked, but Orwyle was probably lying anyway. He likely knew, if not strongly suspected.
4 Kingsguard were condemned. 1, Sir Giles Belgrave, for handing the king the poisoned wine, and the other 3 were not judged to be part of the plot, but were marked for death anyway because the king was killed under their watch, which is the ultimate failure for a Kingsguard. The 3 remaining White Cloaks who were not in the capital during the murder were judged innocent. The plot was hatched and carried out all while they were gone, and thus could not have prevented it. The wolf was harsh, but not so harsh as to condemn those doing their duty away from King's Landing.
Few others could claim that exception, however. For example, Sir Perkin claimed that he had been pardoned for his treasons, but Lord Stark replied, "Not by me," and marked him for death. Many unnamed staff were condemned as well, such as the king's litter bearers who carried him while he drank the poisoned wine, the man who poured the wine, and the keeper of the royal wine cellars. Though this one seems a little unfair because it seems to us that the wine was probably poisoned after it was taken out of the cellars, but I guess Lord Stark deemed otherwise. Still, if there were any notable exceptions to these death sentences, we aren't told of it, except of course the case of Lord Corlys, who was pardoned thanks to Black Aly, Rhaena, and Baela as we described, and one other case that also involved Lady Baela Targaryen.
She refused to allow the condemnation of the men who had risked their lives to free her from captivity, even though they had slain other guardsmen in the process. She had no legal right to overturn the Hand's decision, and at first Lord Stark denied her, but he changed his mind after she pulled a sword and threatened to cut the hand off any man who would lay a hand on her rescuers. The Hand of the king smiled at this, and let her keep her dogs, as he called them. A clever way to put it, and to justify his change of mind. Dogs are typically excluded from trials, after all, though perhaps that's an irony, because all these trials were judged by a wolf.
One man who may have caught the joke is Lord Larys, who said, "When was a wolf ever moved by words?" and no more. A man of few words, even when words were his only hope. Larys must have been convinced that he had no way out, and to be fair, he was most certainly right. It's hard to imagine the incredibly stubborn and upright Cregan Stark showing him any mercy whatsoever. Larys had participated in the poisoning of Aegon and the initial usurpation of the throne from Rhaenyra, among other things.
If Stark could have condemned him twice, he probably would have, but it remains interesting that Larys didn't even try to avoid his fate. Baela and Black Aly convinced Cregan to change his mind so it wasn't completely impossible, but those were the only 2 who managed it, and Larys probably wouldn't have gotten any traction, offering himself for marriage. Nor was he a Targaryen princess. It does seem that Cregan had a soft spot, and it was probably the only soft spot he had. For brave women, which Larys was not one of. With the trials complete, it was time for the sentencing.
The morning of the executions dawned grey and wet. All those condemned to die were brought up from the dungeons in chains to the Red Keep's outer ward. There they were forced to their knees whilst Prince Aegon and his court looked on. As Septon Eustace led the doomed men in prayer, beseeching the Mother to have mercy on their souls, rain began to fall. It rained so hard, and Eustace droned on so long, that we began to fear the prisoners might drown before their heads could be cut off, says Mushroom. At last the prayer concluded, and Lord Cregan Stark unsheathed ice, the Valyrian greatsword that was the pride of his house. For the savage custom of the North decreed that the man who passed the sentence must also wield the sword, that their blood might be upon his hands alone.
Looks like Eustace, fresh out of jail, in addition to rejoining the ranks of historical eyewitnesses, got back to being a septon as well, though it doesn't appear anyone was particularly grateful for that. They probably would have preferred a speedier septon. Even before being led out into the yard, we doubt that many of the condemned had illusions about getting out alive. If you believe that Northmen are bloody and brutal savages, you can't expect them to go easy on you after judging you guilty of treason and or regicide. They had faced the wolf at trial and had his measure. All knew this was a stubborn, overbearing man intent on putting justice first, though it would take a while. There were a lot of condemned men, and only one, Lord Stark.
But many, if not most, seem to have forgotten one important factor about Northerners and the condemned. Any man facing execution can take the black instead, to give their life to guarding the realm instead of to the executioner. Southron lords do not always honor this request, but for a Stark of Winterfell to not do so would be unheard of. When Sir Perkin the Flea told Lord Stark he wished to take the black, it became clear that many of the other condemned hadn't considered that option. But suddenly it was their most fervent desire. We're told by Mushroom that, quote, all of them began to shout at once, like a chorus of drunks bellowing out the words of a song they half remember.
When Sir Perkin's request was granted, nearly everyone else on the block asked for the same, and their wishes were granted as well. Lord Stark's execution queue got dramatically shorter. He wouldn't be spending all morning chopping off heads after all. In fact, it would only be 2 heads and 1 foot. The keeper of the wine cellars, the litter bearers, even the King's Guard were all spared and allowed to go to the wall. Most of the King's Guard, that is. One of the white cloaks refused to swap his cloak for a black one. Sir Giles Belgrave held true to the belief that a King's Guard shouldn't long outlive his king, and was executed. The other King's Guard thought otherwise, and they ended their days on the wall.
Larry Strong did not accompany them either. He was the other of the 2 to die that day. He was just as unwilling to argue for his fate as he was willing to take the black. But he did have a final request. He asked Lord Cregan to remove his clubfoot after removing his head. A simple enough request, and Lord Stark granted it. The Dothraki say a wedding without at least 3 deaths is a dull affair. So what would they say about a day of executions with only 2 deaths? I do think they'd be disappointed, and explaining the wall to them would be tricky. They don't build walls at all, let alone 700-foot tall ones made of ice. But I think they'd approve of Lord Cregan's Valyrian steel greatsword ice, and the idea of Kingsguard dying with their king, just as Blood Riders are meant to join their calls in the Nightlands.
The 2 heads were mounted on either side of the Red Keep's gates, while Larys's bones eventually made their way to Harrenhal to be buried with his ancestors. It's unclear if the Strongs bury their dead beneath the heart tree there, or if they have a different practice. The Strongs were much older than Harrenhal, but now they were gone. Although Larys did have sisters, so the bloodline continued matrilineally. And there are Strongs in the Golden Company even now, but whether they're actually descended from House Strong in any way is unknown, given members of the Golden Company are allowed to take any name they wish. Not to mention, we also have the monstrous Sir Robert Strong, also known as the undead Gregor Clegane, who once held Harrenhal briefly, but we don't think he counts either.
For some reason, Lord Stark decreed that Larys' foot should be buried separately, but even more perplexingly, someone stole it. Mushroom says the severed foot was used for sorcery, a story also told about the foot of young Prince Joffrey. We're not sure what to make of that, and neither are the sources. But if Varys' manly parts can be used in sorcery, why not Larys' foot? But to date, these are the sole examples of foot magic we're aware of. That's the foot. And now for the hand of the king. He resigned his position the very next day and announced his intention to return to Winterfell with his new bride straight away. He was likely eager to make some brothers and sisters for his only son, Rickon. As it turned out, there would be no brothers born to his stepmother, Black Aly, but there would be many sisters.
More urgently, there was the matter of winter, which the North must always reckon with, and which was well underway, even in the South. It would be a 5+ year winter, one of the worst ever. And such is not ideal in any scenario, but is particularly difficult after a civil war.
A winter wedding. By the end of 131 AC, Septon Eustace tells us, a grey calm had settled over King's Landing and the Crown Lands.
As the curtain fell on the era history would name the Dance of the Dragons, winter was setting in across Westeros. The arrival of winter and the grey calm Septon Eustace refers to may even be an apt metaphor for Aegon III's melancholy reign. But before that reign could begin, there must be a coronation and a wedding, one that was meant to heal the fractured family that occupied the Red Keep.
And so on the 7th day of the 7th moon of 131 AC, a day we're told is sacred to the gods, and a day that was a mere 2 years, 4 months, and 4 days after the death of King Viserys I, his grandson Aegon III was married to his granddaughter Jaehaera in an open-air ceremony atop Visenya's Hill, and then crowned hours later at the Red Keep with great pomp and ceremony. Hundreds of lords and ladies and thousands of small folk and even dozens of guests from across the narrow sea gathered in what Gyldayn calls a fragile air of forced fellowship, to celebrate the union that ostensibly marked the end of the dynastic conflict that had consumed so many and so much over the preceding 28 months.
What the wedding and coronation lacked in joy, they made up for in spectacle. Both bride and groom possessed traditional Targaryen beauty, and the lavish ceremony would have rivaled any of those held by their ancestors had it not lacked dragons. With both the new king's and queen's dragons dead in the war, Aegon Stormcloud during the Battle of the Gullet, and Jaehaera's Morgul during the storming of the Dragon Pit, and Aegon reportedly terrified of dragons since seeing Sunfire consume his mother, there would never again be a triumphal flight around the city for a new Targaryen monarch.
Conspicuously absent from both ceremonies was the Dowager Queen, Alicent Hightower. Alicent had utterly lost the plot when her son Aegon was murdered. When the Greens and Aegon were first in the ascendancy, she had agreed to the conciliatory betrothal of Jaehaera to Aegon the Younger, but by the end of her son's short reign, it was she who advised him to cut off Aegon's ear to convince the Riverlords to halt their southward march along the King's Road. When her son was murdered just hours later, according to Gyldayn, her heart was turned to stone.
While none of the new leaders at court wanted to execute the Dowager Queen, though her actions of the past 28 months would certainly have warranted a sentence of treason, no one knew quite what to do with her. She couldn't be allowed around Aegon, for fear she would, at best, rain vicious curses upon him, or at worst, snatch up a knife and attempt to kill him. She couldn't even be trusted with her little granddaughter, after her marriage advice consisted of advising the child to, quote, cut Aegon's throat whilst he was sleeping, which utterly traumatized the already fragile little girl.
And so, following her son's funeral, Alicent had been confined to her quarters in Maegor's Holdfast, where she lived out her days in the company of her septa, alternately weeping and talking to herself. Her absence at the wedding and coronation was noted, but if anyone objected or suggested an alternative, it's not recorded.
After his coronation, the new king's first order of business was to name the Council of Regents and other men who would rule in his name until he came of age. Sir Tywin Lannister, who had only recently urged Aegon the Elder to execute his young nephew, was named Hand, an office he would remarkably serve with honor, while Lord Leoben Corbray was declared protector of the realm. Above them would sit a Council of Regency. 6 strong men and 1 wise woman, 7 to rule us here on earth, as the 7 above rule all men from their heaven, according to Septon Eustace. These 7 were Lady Jane Eyre of the Vale, Lord Corlys Velaryon of Driftmark, Lord Roland Westerling of the Crag, Lord Royce Caron of Nightsong, Lord Manfred Mooten of Maidenpool, Sir Torrin Manderley of White Harbor, and Grand Maester Munkin, the newly arrived replacement for Grand Maester Orwyle. As thrilled as Eustace may have been about the magical number 7, Mushroom was less impressed, asserting, 7 regents were 6 too many. Pity our poor king.
Time would tell about the regents, as it would Aegon's new Kingsguard. Sir Willis Fell, who had been Jaehaera's protector and also served under King Viserys, was named as Lord Commander, with Sir Marston Waters, newly returned from his failed mission to Essos seeking sellswords for the Green Cause, serving as his second. With Aegon unable to forget that Sir Marston had been present and done nothing as his uncle fed his mother to a dragon, Sir Marston's appointment would eventually prove problematic. But the rest of the roster was drawn from Black supporters, as indeed Aegon's Lord Protector and 4 of the regents were, and so for the time being, a delicate equilibrium was achieved. This would eventually be shattered as death, disease, and partisanship took their toll, but that's a complicated story for another day.
You can't go home again. Cregan Stark had stepped down as Hand of the King and announced his intention to return to Winterfell, but before he could take his leave of the South, he faced a thorny problem. Lord Stark had marched south with a great host, made up in large parts of men unwanted and unneeded in the north, whose return would bring great hardship and mayhaps even death for the loved ones they had left behind.
The men who came south with Cregan Stark were essentially the surplus population and represented that northern tradition where graybeards and men with no families would leave their homes as winter set in to avoid becoming a burden on the core members of society. Men with wives and children to support, boys who represented the next generation, lords and leaders with holdfasts and villages to protect, all stayed behind.
But the ones who accompanied Lord Cregan fully expected to die in the south, which explains why Cregan had seemed so eager to bring the fight to any green holdouts, wherever they could be found in the realm. As Cregan told Benjicott Blackwood, "They died the day we marched, boy." I doubt Lord Benjicott brought it up, but Lord Cregan turned out to be quite wrong. Other than the few he lost to Brawls and Bulls of Brown, his ready-to-die graybeards were very much still alive.
With peace apparently achieved through the Sea Snake's letter-writing campaign and the subsequent submission of all the major Green supporters, Cregan had a problem. Returning his men to their homes would almost certainly bring hardship upon those who had been left behind. More mouths to feed meant less food for all, as another unpredictable Westerosi winter seized the north in its grip.
As we mentioned earlier, it was Alysanne Blackwood who suggested a solution to her new betrothed when she reminded him that the Riverlands was full of widows whose husbands had marched off to war and not returned, leaving many with children, farms, and holdfasts to tend to. Men like the ones who had marched with Lord Stark would be welcome in the Riverlands to lend their strength to those who needed help.
And so when Aly returned to the Riverlands with her nephew Lord Benjicott, they would be accompanied by over 1,000 of Stark's Northmen. It was Mushroom who called Aly's idea a wolf for every widow, adding, "He will warm her bed in winter and gnaw her bones come spring." But in spite of the mockery and the inevitable turn to lawlessness of a certain small number of the Winter Wolves, Black Aly's plan, following in the footsteps of her namesake, Good Queen Aly, who was known for her skills at matchmaking, was a resounding success. Gildane tells us that hundreds of marriages were made at what would inevitably be called marriage fairs, held at Raventree, Riverrun, Stony Sept, the Twins, and Fairmarket.
For those who had no wish to marry, there were plenty of lords and landed knights in the Riverlands in need of men-at-arms. All told, the Northmen helped to reinforce the Riverlands at a critical time in their war-torn history, and their presence also led to a somewhat unexpected consequence. Wherever the Winter Wolves settled, there would be a recognizable revival in the worship of the old gods. And we can also speculate on the strengthening of connections between the North and the Riverlands. Though much is made of Lord Rickard Stark's southern ambitions in the latter half of the 3rd century, it's pretty clear that the Starks formed strong ties not only with House Targaryen, but with a number of Riverlands houses, including Tully and Blackwood, in the years surrounding the dance. And it was on this foundation that one of the major political alliances of the series would be built.
But not all of Lord Stark's men chose to stay in the Riverlands. In fact, not even all the veterans from the Riverlands would choose to stay there. In the weeks between the Judgment of the Wolf and Aegon's coronation, a number of Northerners made the choice to cross the Narrow Sea and seek employment as sellswords. With the 3 daughters on the brink of war, sellsword companies were commanding unheard-of wages as the members of the Triarchy engaged in a bidding war for control of available mercenary companies.
And so the Wolf Pack, made up of all Northmen and led by a member of House Hornwood known as Mad Hal and one Timothy Snow, the bastard of Flint's Finger, sought their fortune across the sea. They were followed by the Stormbreakers, a company formed by none other than Sir Oscar Tully, younger brother to Lord Kermit, and 1/3 of the group of heroes from the Riverlands known as the Lads. Membership of the Stormbreakers was varied, including men from the Riverlands, the North, and every other part of the realm, and the name was almost certainly an homage to Oscar's brother Kermit and their fellow Riverlanders who had killed Lord Boros Baratheon and defeated his Stormlanders in the Battle of the King's Road.
Within weeks of the royal wedding, Lord Cregan would return to the north, already experiencing the first major blizzards of winter with a far smaller host than the one he had arrived with. Others made their way back to the Riverlands, Westerlands, Stormlands, and Reach, leaving the new king and his little wife in the charge of the Council of Regents, Hand and Protector. Peace was at hand in the capital and elsewhere, though to be sure the conflict across the Narrow Sea was just beginning, and the Red Kraken continued to be a nuisance in the west. And so the year ended as winter tightened its grip on the Seven Kingdoms.
That fateful year, 131 AC, came to a close with the Caesar flame both east and west of the Seven Kingdoms, and blizzards descending on Winterfell and the north. Who won this war anyway? With the infallibility of hindsight, we now look back through the centuries and say the dance was done, but this seemed less certain to those who lived through its dark and dangerous aftermath.
In the mid-20th century, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain opined, "In war, whichever side may call itself the victor, there are no winners, but all are losers." And there is perhaps no type of war that illustrates Chamberlain's sentiments better than a civil war.
One of the biggest losers may have been the Dowager Queen Alicent. Bereft of all her children and with her remaining grandchild married to the enemy, as she saw it, Alicent's grief caused a madness in her such that she could not be trusted anywhere near the new king, or even with his little queen, her granddaughter. She would die confined to her chambers of the winter fever in 133.
Aegon the Younger himself can hardly be described as a victor. As we noted at the beginning of the episode, the boy king would grow into a singularly joyless man who took no pleasure in the life he lived, his wife and children, or his 26-year reign. A stunted life, to be sure, for a boy who was born his mother's fourth child, and no doubt in his early years expected to grow up to live the life of a dragon-riding prince, perhaps becoming a warrior or marrying a cousin or making some dynastic alliance while supporting first his mother and then his older brother on the throne.
House Targaryen itself may have survived, barely, but as we said at the end of Part 6, the loss of their dragons would result in the fabled Blood of the Dragon becoming almost like any other royal dynasty, subject to the same quirks of fate and political intrigues as all the mere mortals whom they had previously set themselves above. Which leads us to the question whose answer defines the impact of this dance on Westeros better than any other we might ask. How does the realm, and the rest of the world, perceive the Targaryen dynasty now that they have essentially no dragons?
The Targaryen dynasty fell after Robert's Rebellion, which was another 150 years or so after the Dance of the Dragons. So the loss of their dragons didn't immediately cost them the throne, but if they'd still had dragons, well, they might have never lost it at all. Aerys might have fallen, but at least not to Robert or any other dragonless faction. It's safe to guess Rhaegar wouldn't have lost in single combat if he'd fought Robert on Dragonback instead, and perhaps it's even safer to guess that the war wouldn't have happened at all.
And though they held the throne for another century and a half, their authority was not what it had been. The individual scions of the royal house were no longer each on their own threats to the kingdom or others simply by possessing a single dragon. We have not seen another Aemond, another Daemon. We have seen legendary figures and can only wonder what they'd have been like if they did have a dragon. Oberyn Martell is perhaps the character most like Daemon, but can you imagine the Red Viper with a red dragon? Or any color, really.
The name Daemon has appeared many times, including Sir Daemon Sand, Oberyn's squire. Daemon Blackfyre himself was likely named after his great-grandfather, Daemon Targaryen, and was surely the most famous to bear that name after. As great a warrior as he was, he wouldn't have been able to take Harrenhal single-handedly, nor burn it. Nor would anyone burn many castles as Aemon did, which is perhaps why the name Aemond hasn't been used by House Targaryen since.
Nor have any Targaryens burned as many castles as he did. When Mad King Aerys tried to do the next closest thing, destroying King's Landing with wildfire, Sir Jaime Lannister stopped him. But if the Mad King had his own dragon, then who knows if he could have been stopped. Maegor was brutal, but I don't think we've ever had a truly mad dragon rider. The name Daeron has appeared many times, as you all probably well know. Aegon as well, of course. But Alicent? Rhaenyra? Otto? Not so much. Not even Helaena. Perhaps her name was considered unlucky.
Lacking dragons, the Targaryens as a whole turned ever more to the gods as their justification for rule, producing figures like Baelor the Blessed and Aemon the Dragon Knight instead. There were fewer incestuous marriage, although the practice didn't end entirely, though dragons would eventually die out completely in Westeros. Dragon dreams did not. Maester Aemon will later claim that all his brothers dreamed of dragons, and that those dreams killed them.
Those dreams told them many things, but the most pervasive recurring aspect of the dreams was the return of dragons. There is significant evidence that many other Targaryens had similar dreams of the dragons coming again. a prophecy we saw come to pass under Daenerys, which reminds us of this.
Archmaester Rigny once wrote that history is a wheel, for the nature of man is fundamentally unchanging. What has happened before will perforce happen again.
As readers of A Song of Ice and Fire know, it has, and it will.
No doubt.
Archmaester Rigny is George R.R. Martin's nod to James Earl Rigny, better known by his pen name, Robert Jordan, author of The Wheel of Time. Both Jordan and the Archmaester named for him were referring to humans, but here it applies to dragons as well.
The music will be different, and the players as well, but the dragons will dance again.
Thanks so much for joining us today for this 7th and concluding installment of our joint coverage of the Dance of the Dragons. Past installments can be found on Radio Westeros or History of Westeros podcast feeds, and find the video versions on the History of Westeros YouTube channel. Our patrons also have access to the patron-only Red Kraken episode and the forthcoming Johanna Lannister episode, which serves as a sequel to it as well as a standalone story. Find both of our podcasts at patreon.com to support us and gain access to all of our patron exclusives, among other benefits. Speaking of which, now that this series is over, we will be looking at releasing a combined version where all 7 episodes can be watched or listened to with all the credits removed, 7 in 1, the full Dance of the Dragons, for patrons of either Radio Westeros or History of Westeros. And now it's time for us to give credit where credit is due. Thanks to Ashea and Yolkboy, the producers of this episode, both video and audio formats, and to Kevin MacLeod for allowing us to use his music in our production.
To Michael Klarfeld /Klaradox.de and Joey Townsend /Jesse Koval for the History of Westeros music. And as always, thanks to George R. Martin for dancing with us all these years. And finally, we'll close by giving thanks to our patrons. Consider being a supporter of either or both of our podcasts, and you could hear your name here too. From the Radio Westeros Castle Steel level, thanks to Atori Loon, AJ, Aegon VI, Alex, Ali B, Oakenfist, Brian, Casey, Cassandra, Charitable Rereadings, Lady Amalthea, Chris, Christian, Sir Clint the Andal, Convenience or Death, Courtney, David, Darian, Dimitri B, Dennis, Lady Deanna Dane, Esme, Liza, Emily of the Eyrie, Ezra, Felix, Gerald Garcia, Sir Gladworth, Sir Gregor the Toasty, Lord of the Breadfort, Ingvild, Jim McGeehan, something like a lawyer, Red Jimba Rivers, Winter's King, John Ares, writer of the Ice Dragon Cenarion the White Storm, Ara Finway Inglorion, Judson, Katie, Kenneth, Tree Girl, Sir Galahoo of What, Kyle, Laura, Lena Snow, known as the Twilight Star, Lemba, Lynn, Lomas Knight Rider, survivor of the Yeen Sleepover, Lord Leighton of the Highest Tower, Mage Marmot, Monaro Geek TV, Maria, Margaretha, and our cohort of Matts, Matt A, Matt C, Matt K, Matt L, Matt M, Matt R, as well as Beatrix Rainfall, Maester Mary, Molly, Nimble Nick One Iric, Peter Pebble, Peter, PJ, Paul B, Paul H, King Ray, first of his name, Richard, Rickle Pickle, Sam, Sir Swift the Peppered Knight from the House of Black and Grey, Sir Lars-a-Lot of Bee Hill, Soren, the Rat Chef de Cuisine, Terry, Sir Terrence Knight of the Cedars, Steph Lioness, Brave the Tray, Valen Valentine, Maiden of the Black Frost, Vance, Kawarin Halfhand, and Yvonne.
And the History of Westeros patrons, whose Hand of the King is a base-born man-jack, literally just a drunken spearman, gods help us. Lord Giuliano of House U, Hand of Queen Ashea, known as the Omni Knight. Lord Jim the Fortuitous of Wars and Politics of Ice and Fire blog, find it here, and Warden of the West. Lord George Stormsville the Cunning, Lord of the Chiliad and Warden of the East. Cabbath the Unfrozen, Lord of the Bricks and Castle Crimson Light, Defender of the Old Gods and Warden of the North. Lord Donaris Pular, Head of House Pular, Lord of Amora and Warden of the South. Jenny the Just, Captain of the ghost ship Liberty, which vanished in the Shivering Sea over a century ago but has been recently sighted near Volantis, if the tales can be believed. King Beyond the Wall, Sidney Jesse the Fallborn, Lord of Blue Spring and the Haunted Forest, wields a dagger of dragonglass and the Valyrian steel blade Red Frost. Sea Lord Sean Gallagher, the Titan's Benger, owner of 9 Valyrian steel ears, the bastard of the Bay of Seals, a friend of the Night's Watch, commanding a ship made entirely of weirwood. The White Walkers, Alexander Greyblood, first of the First Men, now crowned in ice, called Silence Bringer, Woodblinder, and Snow of Night, wielder of the ice-forged greatsword Pale Frost. Nevada Pike, Fourth of Frost, Frost Kraken, drowned in ice, commander of cats and krakens. The Small Council, Lord Taylor of House Lineberry, Strength of Stone, Will of Iron, Master of Coin. Lord Chris B. of House Baelish, Always Keep Your Foes Confused, Master of Whisperers. Drowned Dan, Lord of House Windsor, Master of Karate, Friendship for Everyone and Ships. Lord Goodkill McGee, Ruler of Castle Over Yonder, Master of Laws. Grand Maester Scotty. And the lords and ladies in their castles, Lady Direliz of Castle Knocky, the Alpha Patron, Lord Dan of the Red Mountains and Castle Greatbell, Breaker of the Second Stone, Gregor the Toasty, Lord of the Breadfort, Ashlyn Winter the Hawkseye, Lady of Castle Skyfall, the Lord of the Halls of Castle Hillcrest, wielder of the Valyrian steel machete Everglazed, Lord Bemmy Snugglebunny, Guardian Ranger of the Hidden 100-Acre Weirwood, dual wielder of Valyrian short swords, Glorious Morning, and Little Lightwise, sharpshooter of the Weirwood and Ironwood laminated longbow, Todd von Oben. When you fear things cannot get worse, Snugglebunny enters the fray. The Bastard of the Wolfswood, first forester of the Old Gods, sworn to House Iron Weirwood. Listen for the silence. Casey Stark of House Acres, Peter Rivers, the Pale Dragon and heir to Bloodraven. Lady Mora of House Stark, Archmistress of Apothecaries and Woodswitch. Her castle features weirwood doors with painted moons. Lena Snow, the Twilight Star, bastard daughter of Dane, wife of the Trickster, and Lady of Castle Rivia. Jason Stark, second son of the North, wielder of the Valyrian steel sword Bloodbath, Lord of Castle Whitewood. The chill is real. Suckass Gamer, master of soap and clay. Aminda Pinkwolf, lady and ruler of Castle Whitefast. The ice emboldens. Lord Benjen of House Hornwood. Lady Rebecca Stark of Castle Aurora, wielder of a weirwood bow with Valyrian steel-tipped arrows and friend of Shortround the Direwolf. Aurelian Matthias Resius, Lord of House Aurelian, ruler of Domus Aurelianus and the Valley of Tanasi, wielder of Sol Invictus, Valyrian steel, keeper of the largest collection of books outside the Citadel. We restore the world. Lord Garin of Devil's Hand Keep. Lady Jane of House Celtigar, wielder of the Valyrian steel axe Painkiller. Lord Darian the Daring, wielder of the Valyrian steel sword Wisdom, Lord of House Hollingsworth and the Hollyhold of Dorne, power in knowledge. Sir Garrett Gabehart, Lord of the Bluegrass. Gabe the Jade Blade, whose foes are skewered and grilled. Lady Maria of House Hightree, Lady of the Castle Fair Oak on the Crooked Lake. Sigil is a long grapevine with dark green leaves and purple grapes winding around a gray stone pillar on a white field bordered by gold. Motto is ever watchful. The Queen's High Council, Grand Archmaester Rennie, whose rod and ring and mask are quartz crystal, wielder of the Valyrian steel pen, fire and ink. The Purple Lord Leo Anansi, Master of Whisperers. Lady Wolfbird, Mistress of the Eastern Rivers, Gatekeeper of the Northern Skies, Daughter of the Silver Sea, and Master of Coin. Devorland Blackwood, maker of the Frozen Fury Muscle Bomb, eucalyptus and mint leaves washed with Dornish peppers and sealed by fire ants. Master of Laws. Lady Jane of Driftmark, Guardian of Dragonstone, the Circling Flame Burns, Master of Ships. Lady Sonia of Sunspear, Keeper of the Martell Menagerie, Master of Castle Tormira Topanga, Tame and Keep Well, Master of Whisperers. The King's Guard, Lord Commander Jackson, Sir Dean the White, Knight of the Black Star, Sir Bateman the Dark Knight, Lady Ani, Bringer of Winter's Warning, Watcher in the Weirwood, Bearer of Wristwolves, Lord Jonathan of House Tanner, Lord Raydetto of House Avocado, Protector of the Royal Kitchens, Green in the morning, dark by evening. The Queen's Guard, Lord Captain Commander Hema Helmont, the Sellsword Sentinel, James the Green, Lord of the Meadows, Keeper of the Trial of Grasses, Amber the Adamant, Knight of the Mist and Mother of Squids, the Wintry Wolverine, we finish what you began. Nora Nico, Archmaester Vena, whose ring and rod and mask are made of steel, not pudding, Laura Boros, the Lady of Infinity. The Beard Guard, Lord Commander George the Golden, Lady Rita of the Coppermane, the Unbound, Dance the Fervor, Sir Jeff, Warden of the AC, wielder of Triad, the multifaceted beard of platinum, red, and brown. Stay frosty. Bloody Ben Blackwood, Big Brian Blackwood, Davin Mack, Knight of the Reeds, the Bog Knight. and the History of Westeros Night's Watch. Lord Commander Richard the Ligerheart, wielder of Barry's Anklebreaker, a flail with blue and silver Valyrian steel spikes. Motto, Go Blue. First Builder Maegor Snow, a.k.a. Maegor the Cool, the fire in the snow. First Ranger Liam, a.k.a. Sir Waiting on a Nickname. First Steward Sir Zack of House Wild, Lord Shredder of the Spiral, wielder of the Valyrian steel axe, Grail. We'll see you all again soon with new episodes of Radio Westeros and History of Westeros. Bye for now.
Valar Rereadus.